Okay, guys, attention to brief. We're starting now. So let's. Hey, good morning, membership of our foundation. We're so happy that you've joined us this morning, and I want to have a special welcome to our guests who have come aboard to see our keynote David T. Leighton speaker, Patrick K. O'Donnell. Most of you are no stranger to Mr. O'Donnell, as he's written one bestseller after another, and he's also supported us before with a treatise on one of our second Saturday programs on his book, The Unknowns, which coincided with the USS Olympia bringing the unknown from France to the United States for further transfer to the hallowed and very holy ground at Arlington National Cemetery, whose identification is known but only to God. But thank you for coming in today to our meeting. We had sent out all of the annual reports and the electrons that you'll also see pushed during this session. For your planning purposes, the business portion of the meeting will go about 30 minutes, and then we'll get into the David T. Leighton lecture. So again, thank you very much. We've sent out a lot of communications to you, and so to that end, you saw the minutes from the last annual meeting. And so what I would like to do is to take a vote to accept the minutes from our 2021 annual meeting. All those, is there a motion? Motion, second, and all those in favor say aye, and opposed. Well, the ayes have it. So anyway, thank you very much for accepting those minutes. I'd like to turn the program over to our chairman for his opening remarks, and then we'll get into the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonny, and thanks to you and the staff for your yeoman work this past year. It's been a challenge, as I'm sure everyone appreciates, so that coming out of the COVID lockdowns has been very slow, and particularly impacting of our ability to host events here at the Navy Yard in particular. Just have not been able to do much of anything, and so it's had a negative impact on income, because these events and the sponsorship of them has been a significant source of revenue to us in recent years. That's not occurred, but it hasn't slowed the organization down. They've been hard at work. We've been hard at work with your support, taking advantage of electronic media to disseminate information on Thursdays with a wealth of interesting historical data and links and videos. And if you're not a regular subscriber to those and actually looking at them, you're missing the boat. I think it's just tremendous opportunity in content. And then our Saturday events, some of the subject matter, the majority of it, has been phenomenal. The quality of the interactions, way above what I would have expected at the start. It's exceeded my expectations. And although I've been a little disappointed at the, sometimes at the number of folks that are tuning in live, the follow-on on YouTube's have been extraordinarily large. And I get it. Everybody has things they may need to do on Saturday mornings, and that's fine, but we're getting very, very wide coverage of people replaying these second Saturdays, and that's really been terrific. So as you'll see a little bit later on, we're continuing to try to schedule events, live events, and include as many people as we can in those as we can through the rest of the year. We're continuing our recognition programs, and all that's good. So I would like to make one comment. I am a little bit skeptical of our dissemination ability to get out the annual report. And it's important, I think, that you actually get a copy of it, and if you are inclined to take the time to read it, because that will give you in great detail the information about what we've really been up to during this past year. And I think it's, as members, it's important that you know that. I'm just not sure. I know that it was pushed electronically to everybody on our electronic list. Say again? But anyway, if you have not seen it or somehow it didn't get to you, let us know somehow. Send us an email, a tweet, a thump in the head, or a letter if you're still so inclined to use a pen and paper. And let us know. We'll make sure we get it to you. And for those like a certain age, like myself, who really like to hold a piece of paper in your hands, again, I'd highly recommend the Pull Together, which is bigger, not necessarily bigger, but better, event by event. So that's about it. I have one thing that I'm delighted to be able to do, and that's we would not be able to exist around here without extraordinary help from a dedicated cadre of volunteers who enable us to do the things we try to do, particularly with limited staff these days. And so our winner of the Volunteer of the Year Award, Lieutenant Commander retired Sean Walsh, is here with us in person. And Sean, if I could invite you to come on up here and join me here at the podium. I want to thank you. His smiling face is often seen around whatever we do here. And again, without the dedicated support of Sean and several others who have helped us immeasurably, we wouldn't have been able to get it done. So, Sean, it's a treat for me to
thank you, sir.
Give you a small memento of our appreciation. And this is one of the famous Truxton Bowls, which has a history which you know probably better than most, and I'll turn it around and let the photographer take care of this. But Sean, thank you very much for your time, and thanks to your lovely wife for putting up with this business and having him seconded to us for all
Keep me out of the way.
I'll invite Sean to say a couple of words.
I did notice the picture of me with Jesse the 15th, who, if you haven't heard, was
kind of retired early, but got a full pardon from SecNav the other week. And somebody, Tyler, Robinson, who used to work here, said, "Gee, hope my reputation wasn't tarnished by that association." But I just want to say, so history. I'm an engineer. For those who don't know, I served actually my entire career as an engineer duty officer, and but history was always my favorite subject after the engineering-related ones. And so I was always aware of naval history. My parents both served in and actually met in the Navy. And the fun thing was that at the time they met, my mom was a chief petty officer, serving in BR1. Before that, she had been a Bureau of Yards and Docks. My dad, after World War II service in the Army as an infantryman, was a supply officer and an ensign actually at the time they met and got married. So he always talked about, well, she married down. But I was always aware of their history growing up. And so last year I was actually getting ready to retire from a paying job. That's what I tell people is, I'm not retired. It's just only for a job that gives me a paycheck. So I was looking for other things to do. And so I had become aware of NHF, had followed it for a while. And I first knew of it because of a link in Commander Salamander's blog. But there was lots of articles, and particularly I remember the one that Captain George Stewart had a series of articles about his career, which I found really interesting because he had actually been, when I was at ensign on USS Tatnall, he was actually the senior examiner for the PEB that we had. And we also turned out there were some other people I knew in common with him. And so also your past president, who unfortunately I didn't get to meet, he passed away about the time I joined Rear Admiral Mitchell. I had actually met as a captain. He was also engineering duty, and so we had a brief meeting with him. I was very impressed by him. And so, but anyway, all this and the example, my parents also volunteered a lot in their retirement, and also Terry encouraged me to stay busy and do things, and so this was a logical thing to do. So I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks again, Sean, and thanks, Terry, for moving them along the road here. I think I'll wrap it up here. I'm going to turn it back over to Sonny Masso for the membership section. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and I too am so grateful for the support that we've had all through the year and beyond from Sean Walsh, and we thank Terry as well. The membership slides, just a slide, and I just want to tell a quick story. We always want more members, and we're real excited when we get them, and particularly some of the content that we push. As being a member, you get the Pull Together magazine, you get the second Saturday shows, we're calling them actually, that have been cutting edge, and we always celebrate the Navy. We had a tremendous program just last month on getting our ships back in the game, shipyard and ship repair facility excellence. And we had Dr. Craig Simons come in and tell the story of the USS Yorktown, and it was brought into the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. They thought they needed 90 days for repairs from battle damage from the Battle of the Coral Sea. And Admiral Nimitz gave some commanders intent and said, you have 3 days. And so they got it done, albeit they had some yard workers welding and doing things even while underway, but the Yorktown was able not only to participate in the Battle of Midway, but to contribute mightily in that battle. We got some members from that, and we appreciate it. If you look at our membership statistics, we've been hovering for about 5, 6, 8, or 9 more years around 1,000. Sometimes we get to about 1,010. I think, and it fluctuates based on fundamentally your renewal rate. And you've been very generous in renewing, at least within 60 days. Sometimes you need a nudge, but you might consider, if it makes it easier for you, joining as a life member. 48% of all our members are life members, and so we appreciate that very much. But right now we're a little lower than the 987 number. The 987 number reflects December, the end of the year, And so we're just waiting for some summer renewals, and I know they'll come in. So that really reflects our report. But thank you for joining. One thing we appreciate about our members is, first of all, you're a membership of great sophistication. You know the history. When you participate in our programs, when you write the unsolicited note, it's always rich in content and deep in thought. And that's who we are, and that's our organization, and that's why we're so proud to have you aboard. So tell a friend, renew if you can't remember if you're renewed or not, go on our website, www.navyhistory.org, and join us again or renew. And that concludes my membership portion, and I'm now going to segue. I'm not Rear Admiral Vince Griffith. He had a little incident with some COVID, so I'm going to fill in for him with the financial report. Now, for those of you who get the digital electrons, you receive the annual report, so this is a reflection of that. And basically, money in the bank, we've got about just a little over $100,000 money in the bank that we can draw from for operating expenses. Bottom line on this, it's not on the chart, but we spend about $45,000 a month, and so that takes us a little bit over $500,000 for a given year. And because of the pandemic and some other stressors not unrelated to stress you might feel in your businesses or your personal lives, we've been operating in a deficit of about $270,000 annually. And so to that end, we've got challenges and opportunities to make some of that up. We have in our individual investment account a little over $1 million, and we're real pleased with that. And the market, even though it's uncertain right now, we had a good year last year with the market dynamics, and we're very pleased by that. But if you were looking at the estimated months of operations, we've got funds available to take us over 2 years. And of course, this is the very most conservative, most dire, kind of projection in our minds. Though, I'm the eternal glass is half full guy. I've got a lot of energy, if you didn't know that, and so I'm going to push that out a little bit further than even the 28 months. Next chart. Just by the view of the projection, you see our projected revenues and expenditures, and of course, the expenditures exceed the projected revenue, and so that's my challenge as the executive director, and it's what I think about every day: fundraising, finding those programs of rich content that you would participate in, and hopefully tell a friend about, so that we can get your donations. One thing that I'm very proud of, and it's probably maybe one of the most proud things that I feel about you, our members, is when we send that letter out for the mid-year ask and the end-of-the-year ask, you really do give sacrificially, and we cannot tell you how much we appreciate that, and especially the kind notes that you write when you send us a check or do a direct deposit online. But we appreciate it. We don't take it for granted, and it helps us sustain our mission. And so thank you for that. And we're standing by. We're ready for parties and bar mitzvahs. So if you find yourself with a few extra sources of revenue, we would appreciate that. So thank you so much. The next chart is the projected and annual expenses, and so I think the great news story of this, it's not all dire, but the great news is that we have done everything in our control, everything, to keep our expenses down. If you think of the programs that we run, the products that we provide, this pulled together magazine is extraordinary, and we get letters from other entities that want to borrow our content, and we always say yes. But then our Thursday tidings, one thing we appreciate you, the membership, doing is that if for some reason we're trying to get a story straight, or we're trying to get a piece of video, and it may take the delivery of that content a couple extra hours, you start ringing my email, like, where's the tidings today? And I love that about you. You always tell it like it is, but you like our content. And then, of course, our second Saturday. So to that end, what we provide for the people that we have on our staff is unbelievable. So we do not squander your money, and I want you to know that. Next chart. So finally, in this chart, we started 2021 with 1.3 million. We utilized 200,000 to take care of our day-to-day accounts, and so we ended up a little bit over $1 million, as we've said in previous charts. The revenue was 10% lower than forecast because we had 5 events, and we only ended up having 2. Or actually 3, but the 3 events we had 2 Dudley W. Knox Award luncheons. We did a luncheon and a dinner, and then we did the United States Naval Academy's Superintendent's Leadership and Vision Award, thanks to the benevolence of Dr. Jennifer London and her support of hers and her late husband Jack's support for that program. So we had both of those events, but we weren't able to have some of the others that we thought we might have, such as a SecNav reception and things like that. As we look to the future, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, we've got a couple of exciting events, 3 to be exact, coming up, and we'll get into that at a different time. Next chart. Again, we spoke about your philanthropy and your benevolence, and it's so appreciated. But we had 6 major donors contribute $90,000 to our foundation, and as well, our board is not slacking. They've provided right around $50,000, and this is deeply appreciated. And of course, that doesn't count in some respects the mid-year monies that you provide at the end of the year. So the other thing is that we took advantage of 2 rounds of the payroll protection program from the pandemic, and those loans are forgiven. Everything's a wash on that for us. But special recognition and thanks go to the good people at Capital Bank. They made sure we were first in line. I literally filed for that paperwork with great assistance from them. It was approved in 2 days. When do you ever see that happen? And then the forgiveness paperwork was forgiven within about 3 weeks after that process started. And there's no better bank to support us in this endeavor than them. So those are my, I guess, and then finally in the summary chart, just this isn't just enough to say we aspire to raise more money. We're really working this hard, and we're really so lucky to have Admiral Fallon as our chairman, and Admiral Pandolf as our president, and the board that we have to support us. And just coming off of a wonderful annual meeting that we just had a board meeting, pardon me, the whole board meeting was geared around discussions around how we do better in fundraising in the future. So if I were you out there, and you have any questions, you reach me, emasso@navyhistory.org. I'm always there for you, and I know that you know that. Anyway, if you got ideas, if you got plans, if you got criticisms, just let me know, and I always listen to you, and I always appreciate your feedback. It's now my honor to introduce Dr. David Rosenberg and Mr. Marty Bollinger, who will speak after him, to talk about our recognition committee reports. And just as we thanked and recognized Sean Walsh for his great efforts with us, Dr. Rosenberg and Mr. Bollinger will recognize some other rock stars in our enterprise. So I love you guys. Reach out to me if you got any questions, and thank you for your time. Dr. Dave, over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. I'm delighted to be able to recognize a number of good folks. This will be in two parts. I will provide information initially on National History Day and some of our prize essays, and then Marty Bollinger will follow me, and then I will follow in an additional recognition. First of all, next slide, please. We're recognizing the folks from the National History Day. This is the Captain Ken Koski Prize, named for the late Captain Koski, who was a Vietnam POW, Distinguished Naval Aviator, and also Executive Director of the Naval Historical Foundation. Next slide, please. We have two winners. Miss Jessie Henderson of Cleveland, Tennessee, received the Koski Award at the senior level for her video titled Aerographer's Mates, Communicating Weather from Sea to Shining Sea. And Ms. Rebecca Bemis of Plattsville, Connecticut, received the Koski Junior Level Award for her video Mavis Beatty and the Geese That Never Cackle. Next slide, please. We will I'll now announce the Vice Admiral Robert F. Dunn NROTC essay contest. Admiral Dunn was our longtime president, mentor to me as well, and mentor to many members of the board. Next slide, and is still with us, thankfully. The winner is Midshipman Will Stefanon, University of San Diego. He earned the grand prize for his essay, 6 Cornerstones of Naval Tactics and Our Future. Next slide. The Captain Edward L. Beach Prize for Excellence in Naval History at the U.S. Naval Academy. Captain Beach, I believe, as you all know, we had a Saturday seminar on him, and all his great work. Was a distinguished submariner, Navy Cross winner in World War II, and also then went on as a pioneer nuclear submariner, writing many, many books on both naval history and his multiple novels, starting with Run South, Run Deep. The recipient of this award is Midshipman First Class Peter Pissarro at the U.S. Naval Academy. And I will now turn this over to Marty Bollinger.
Thank you and good morning. I'm here to announce the results of our annual Superintendent's Award, Leadership and Vision Award. It's an award at the Naval Academy for midshipmen. The intent is to help them understand how to link lessons from our past and naval history to the challenges we face as a nation today and to help inform that dialogue. It's an award that's been around for 5 years. And again, I'd like to thank Dr. Jennifer London for continuing the great tradition of her late husband, Jack London, in establishing this award. We had 3 winners this year. Midshipman Second Class Nels Warren won the award with his paper on lessons learned from the early days of Star Wars, having lived through the troubles when we consider that history now, how that might be applied to the current threats the Navy might face and how those lessons can be applied to developing means of defeating current threats. Second place award came to Midshipman Third Class Quentin Zimmer for a paper that sought to revisit our thinking about Japan's strategy in the Pacific in the Second World War, and the lessons learned from the U.S. efforts to defeat that strategy that can be applied today to China. The third place award went to Midshipman First Class Peter Pissarro. Yes, that is the same recipient of the Beach Award, for his paper, Three Cobblers Partnership, Lessons Learned from China's Past and How They Might Seek to Create Asymmetric Threats in the Pacific that we might have to deal with. I'd like to congratulate all 3 winners and look forward to next year's competition. I also want to thank the judges that volunteered their time, resident naval historians, executives in industry, retired senior admirals, for their contribution to the award program. Thank you. One last thing to note, we have our own recognition here. Our own Dr. David Winkler was awarded the National Maritime Historical Society Award for his long career and work in naval history. I'd just like to recognize him for that award as well. Thank you.
Finally, I'm here to provide notes on the award, the Knox prizes, the 2022 Commodore Dudley W. Knox recipients. The Dudley Knox Award is for career achievement in naval history, in American naval history in particular, and I'm pleased to note that we were able to put together, with Dr. Winkler's assistance, a distinguished panel of former Knox Award recipients, namely Ken Hagan, Ed Merolda, and Paul Stillwell, and together we deliberated on a series of a number of nominees that we have received. And I'm pleased to announce that this year's awardees are, next slide, Dr. Donald F. Bittner. Dr. Bittner is a former senior historian for the U.S. Marine Corps History and Museums Division. He's a University of Missouri PhD, but also a retired lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve, active and reserve Marine. Long experience doing that, but has written a number of very, very important monographs and studies on both U.S. and British Marines, as well as multiple articles, dozens of book reviews and so forth, as well as a lot of great service in support of the Marine Corps and Marine Corps history. Next. Our second awardee, for many folks, needs no introduction. Dr. Norman Friedman, who since the 1970s has been pioneering the study of much of U.S. and British naval history with dozens of incredibly important books, design histories, studies of, in recent years, things like Fighters Over the Fleet, or his most recent book on U.S. Navy attack aircraft. And then also studies, for example, of British submarines in the Second World War and British submarines in the Cold War, as well as his study of the Cold War, the 50-year war. It's a delight to give this to Dr. Friedman, who I have known for almost 50 years, and we will be honored to give this to him at our lunch. And with that, I will now turn this over to, I think we do still have, yes, our National Maritime Historical Society Distinguished Service Award recipient, Dr. Dave Winkler.
Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the activities report, and this what we're going to take a look at first is the one of the big activities that we have evolved in this age of the pandemic and COVID is, I guess it was 2 years ago, we did our first online annual meeting on the second Saturday, and we said, well, let's keep this rolling, because we had a good crowd, and as pretty much our executive director, Sonny Masso, mentioned, we've been on the move here, and so this has become a, we had 12 of these last year, and just a few highlights, I would say. The most viewed last year was the one conducted with Norman Friedman, was one of our panelists. Jim Bryant talked about the reports on the Thresher and how's that going. And new documents have been released, which have been revelation as far as the line of what happened there. Over 35,000 views to date. Perhaps the most fun second Saturday was the Navy in baseball with Paul Stillwell and Matt Eng, which was expertly moderated by Sonny Masso, who I have to add was at a program earlier this week at the Yogi Berra Museum up in Montclair, New Jersey, with former Navy Secretary Ray Mavis and Larry Berra to talk about Yogi Berra's role at D-Day. So that's, by the way, the clip to that was on our last Thursday tidings. I think the best intro to a second Saturday was Admiral Fallon's tour de force of the war in Vietnam in our Vietnam Brown Water presentation. The best autobiographical presentation, Regina Akers and Paul Stillwell again on their documentary on Vice Admiral Gravely last February. And then finally, as far as the most commemorative, I think there's a tie here between our September program, which fell on 9/11, and we had for that one the former CNO Vern Clark and Admiral Bob Nyder reflected about how the Navy reacted to the 9/11 attack. attacks. And then I have to give credit to the Honorable Stephen Honigman for his discussion about the Kimmel and Pearl Harbor for our December second Saturday. So now besides second Saturdays, we actually had our first live seminar in the museum in May. On May 3rd, I got a call from Pete Schwartz, and Pete said, has anybody done anything on the Falklands? Are you doing anything on the Falklands? I said, well, I wasn't thinking about it, but why not? So we did have a very good seminar on May the 3rd, and we looked at it from the American perspective. How did the United States react to this war between Argentina and Great Britain? So we had, John Leighton, who was the Secretary of Navy, gave a good talk about what his reaction working with the Reagan administration, within the Reagan administration. Norman Pollard, lessons learned, and we just posted the 8 lessons learned from his 8 points, the 8 takeaways from the Falklands War from the United States perspective, and then Doug Zuckheim. So that's our first live seminar in 2 years. And then, of course, let's go to the Thursday Tidings slide. That has been rolling along. We had Tyler Robinson last year was managing that for us, and then we brought back Matt Eng, who started the Thursday Tidings a couple of years ago, and he's picked it up and is just doing fabulous work. Now, 2 things I want to talk about the Thursday Tidings is we've started posting our oral history collection 1 per week. So if you go through it, you'll notice that we have a collection of nearly 200 oral histories. It's one thing to collect an oral history, but the key thing is making it accessible. So we have, not only are we posting these things, but we have volunteers who are going through some of the oral histories that never have been edited. They're putting them together into presentable formats, and we're posting those. So that's one accomplishment. And then the other thing is the book reviews are so important. And we have perhaps, this is where Sean has been very helpful this past year. He's the guy who, when our volunteers do a book review, he goes through, he does a cut on them, and then he also does the chop on the Thursday Tidings to do some editing, and it's been great. And it's getting our exposure to naval history authors. Finally, Pulled Together. We had 3 of those come out this past year. Of course, Langley, I was the Lindbergh Chair of Aerospace History last year at the Smithsonian. So, you can see the last edition. We kind of celebrated the centennial of Langley's commissioning. And one last thing I want to talk about is the naval documents of the American Revolution. We've posted these, digitized them, working with the Center for Digital Education at the University of Virginia. And what's kind of exciting is that they completed 13 volumes here at the Navy History and Heritage Command, and there's still, up until 1778, there's still a lot of stuff that needs to be posted, and they have expressed an interest in going through what's left and actually adding on to the collection here. So we're working with the Center for Digital Education at the University of Virginia to see if we can make these documents accessible and kind of keep the momentum going into the bicentennial, actually the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Navy. And with that, I'd like to introduce the Director of Naval History, Rear Admiral Sam Cox.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First off, I'd like to thank the Admiral Fallon and Admiral Pandolf and the entire Naval Historical Foundation for the exceptional support that you provide to Naval History and Heritage Command. In particular, what you do to tell the Navy history story to the American public, which is very much a force multiplier for my mission. NHHC is in good shape now. We're bringing to fruition several projects, major projects. Last year, I would have said that our operating funds are sucking fumes because in terms of where we are in the Navy budget process, we're the black sheep in a corral full of sacred cows. But I went to the CNO and he exercised divine intervention and restored our funding to where it had been over the last several years, and we're able to do our mission very well. A couple of major projects. The Constitution, which we're responsible for maintaining, is back fully rigged, doing her normal summer turnaround cruises. If anyone from NHHC wants a spot on that ship for a turnaround cruise, just let me know and I can make that happen. Or if you have someone you think is be beneficial to NHF to get a ride, we can make that happen. In terms of the big projects, on August 9th, we're going to cut the ribbon for the new Naval History Research Center, which my intent is to name it after Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, a personal hero of mine. And that facility, which is on the Navy Yard, will have the operational archives, the library, photo collection, art collection, rare books, sensitive material, underwater archaeology, everything that requires state-of-the-art environmental control in order to preserve it for the long haul. That was originally approved by the VCNO as a $79 million MILCON project. We're bringing it in on time at a total of $42 million. So I expect that the CNO broke ground and he has every intent of coming to cut the ribbon. The other major project that's coming to fruition is the first overhaul of dry docking of the historic ship Nautilus in over 30 years. She'll come out of the dry dock at New London, should be next week, ahead of schedule. That project was originally estimated to cost as much as $140 million, with a scrapping cost of about $78 million, and we were able to bring it in for $36 million, actually under our budget, so we'll be able to use that money for some other things that we need to do. The third major project that's underway is the new National Museum of the United States Navy. Last year, Secretary Braithwaite put $39 million into the 5-year defense plan to establish a program office so that we could do the things that are necessary in order to prepare for a new museum, which actually is an incredible amount of work. But he put his money where his mouth is on that. Concurrently, the Navy has been engaged in a land swap process that is actually very complicated, but the purpose is to trade part of the land on the Washington Navy Yard for land that is just outside the Navy Yard that we want. And this accomplishes two purposes. One, there's a force protection piece to this, and by acquiring that land, it saves the Navy over $200 million in force protection and blast mitigation for Naval Reactors Headquarters and Naval Sea Systems Command Headquarters, and is also the location for that multiple studies have said that's the best spot in the United States for a new National Museum of the United States Navy. The thing that will be of most interest to I think this group is the plan for the Cold War Gallery. My plan for the Cold War Gallery was it would eventually be rolled into the new museum. So all the artifacts and work that went into that will certainly not go to waste. It is intended to go into the new National Museum. The problem at the moment is that the real estate negotiators traded away the Cold War Gallery without letting me know they were doing that before, as part of this whole land deal. Now, our intent was to use Building 70 with the Cold War Gallery after the artifacts were moved to the new museum, use that as a museum support center because of the HVAC upgrades that took place back about 2007. So that's not a completely finalized deal yet. The land swap deal is being negotiated with, and what that means is that I have to use the old museum, Building 76, as a museum support center and also as a temporary location for the material, the artifacts that are currently in the Cold War Gallery, which gets to be kind of a Rubik's
tube operation. But the CNO took the brief on Monday. The real estate guys got sent to go back and answer a bunch of questions that we could have answered if they'd put me in the meeting. But anyway, and then it will go to the SecNav. And I don't know whether it gets real complicated whether Building 70 ultimately ends up in the swap or not. I think is not completely decided yet. So more on that later. So that kind of hits the big muscle movements for NHHC. I've been doing this for 7.5 years, not planning on going anywhere. So I look forward to continuing to work with the foundation and all of you. So thanks for your support.
One of the great privileges of being the executive director of the foundation is working with Rear Admiral Cox and his great people. I can't underscore just the importance of his job and how well he does it. And I thank him not just for the professional relationship we have, but also for our friendship. To that end, when we think about his enterprise at NHHC, a lot of our content that we've pushed out with Second Saturdays especially have included a lot of his people, starting with himself. He's, I think, participated in 3 or 4 of our Second Saturdays, always as the authoritative data source on any given topic. You saw him today without notes, and that's how he rolls. But we've also used Dr. Chris Renfro, formerly retired naval officer, but also from the history department at the Naval Academy. Dr. Pete Haynes, a Notre Dame man, classmates of Sam's deputy, Pat Burns, and a real friend of ours. Dr. John Sherwood. Dr. Sherwood was so enamored with our Falklands program, he actually wrote a personal check to help underwrite, some of our beverages and things. Dr. Gina Akers is just amazing. Anytime we work with her, we get the best and finest of support. And again, as I said, Sam and so many others of his organization. So Sam, thank you for our relationship. Thank you for what you do. And we have your back.
Thank you.
Okay, you're not alone on any of this, okay? So we got it. Okay, so you bring us in on this. I'm really pleased to talk about upcoming events. And for starters, one of the members of our audience who's a member of our foundation, but more importantly, a scholar, a noted historian, but award-winning, one of our Knox winners, Dr. Ed Meralda. He wrote a book called Admirals in Peril, and if you do one more thing today, since it's a rainy day, you get online and you order that book, you get it on your Kindle, and you read it, and you just sit the heck down and take it aboard, because it really is a masterpiece in framing and shaping the era of Vietnam from the Navy PACOM perspective. And it goes back in time, and you can see who the leadership that we enjoyed spoke truth to power. You see some folks who didn't speak truth to power. You see some, examples of conflict between the executive branch, the rest of the folks in the Department of Defense, and then the actual naval heroes themselves. And it's something that, if you think you're a naval historian, you think you're really interested, get that book and read it, and I mean right now. Do it now. Now, okay. So thank you for being here, Ed. And he's going to buy me coffee or something later. What we're going to do this year, we've got 3 big events for us. 2 involve you. 1 is just unique to the foundation, but the first one is we're doing our Knox Medal participation on August the 25th. That's going to be at the Army-Navy Country Club in Arlington. That's been a spectacular venue for us. And more importantly, it allows our recipients, Mr. Bittner and Friedman, to bring family and friends and have it more convenient for them. And we're real excited about that celebration. And listen, you're all invited. And the last one we did was spectacular. And you're going to have a great time. The food at the ANCC is excellent, I say, as a member. The second one that we're going to have that is really restricted to the new flags, but the CNO's office has asked us to help sponsor a new flag orientation reception, and so we're going to do that in the National Museum of the United States Navy. And we're real pleased to do that, and we'll do anything for our Navy. And then finally, and this is a really big one, so if you think about 2022 in naval history, if you go back 100 years, we have the advent in the commissioning of the USS Langley CV-1. And it's a great story because there were two milestone events concomitant with that. And they didn't call funding back in those days SCN, new ships accounts, and OPN, and all that. So what they did was they just declared victory in one fiscal year, and they commissioned the ship. But then it was finally ready about 7 months hence to start landing and recovering or launching and recovering aircraft. And so to that end, a big portion of our uniformed Navy and organizations such as the Program Executive Office for Nuclear Carriers, the Air Boss from California, as well as the Director of Aviation Warfare, Air Warfare in the Pentagon, they've been celebrating for an entire year these events. The first event was in Norfolk, coincident with a Navy League sponsored event in March, and we're going to kind of put the coda on this at our 5-star dining out. So we're expecting lots of uniforms, we're expecting lots of attendees, and we want you to be chief among those attendees. So these are going to be great fundraising events for us, but more importantly, they're going to be great networking opportunities where we celebrate Navy history. So to that end, I want to thank you for participating today. We're not done yet, and we're getting ready for the big part of our show. But again, it's my honor to be your foundation's executive director. I love you guys. I love the foundation, and off and running for a great 2022. It's now my privilege to introduce our chairman, someone who's been here about 5 years or more, 6, 7 years, tireless efforts. Thanks only of you, Admiral Bill Ballin. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Sonny. And I want to pass on a couple of comments. First, some kudos to Sonny and the staff for their extraordinary work in keeping this organization going. In some difficult times the last couple of years, given the onslaught of COVID and the impact it's had, particularly on our public events. But it's a lean and mean staff. We've managed to, with their initiative, to adjust to mostly electronic delivery. It appears to be well accepted by the younger generation, as well as some of us dinosaurs that have managed to adapt. And so thanks, Sonny, for a great job. To Admiral Cox and his crew from NHHC. Also challenging times for a lot of reasons, not least of which is fiscal, with the major initiative of the desire to have a new museum, which we all strongly second and are trying to support in every way. But given Navy's challenges today, the fact that Sam is up there looking for help to keep going and to keep energizing his command is often a challenge. But Sam, good on you. Keep stroking. It's my great pleasure right now to introduce our annual Leighton Lecture. It's to be presented by Mr. Patrick K. O'Donnell here in a minute or so. But first of all, to remind all of us that this is in memory of the late Commander David T. Leighton, who had a phenomenal passion for naval history, served the Navy for many years. Very interesting background. Naval Academy graduate, class in 1945. He also went on a few years after that to MIT, got a bachelor's in electrical engineering, and then was one of the first in the class to get a master's degree in nuclear engineering. I believe probably the first to actually come back and serve in the Navy, which he did for several decades. right-hand man to Admiral Rickover in the then nascent Navy nuclear power program. Commander Leighton served on active duty and then transitioned to a civilian position, continuing to support naval reactors and the great work they've done in bringing nuclear power into the Navy. He did many things, but probably near the top of the list of most noteworthy was being a key engineering motivator and someone that brought to fruition the Nimitz class carrier and downsizing to 2 reactors to drive that ship. Those who were in the business will remember that Enterprise had 8 reactors, and the cost of the potential to continue that in the newer class of carriers was very daunting. And so his engineering skill and foresight in transitioning to 2 is very, very noteworthy. I'd also like to highlight the generosity of Commander Leighton's family in continuing to support this annual lecture. We're indebted to them and thank them very much. So today we are very, very pleased to have with us Patrick K. O'Donnell. He's an author of some renown. He's written over a dozen books. If I revealed the exact number, it might be a little bit daunting, but he's become well known. He's also well known to us here because just a few months ago participated in one of our second Saturdays in doing a presentation on his book, The Unknowns, which remembered the role of a number of young people in that area that were instrumental in the selection of the remains of what turned out to be the unknown that was brought back by the Olympia from France and now entombed over at Arlington Cemetery. But today he's going to introduce us to another group of folks relatively unknown, I would say, by most in this country and even among historians. His book, The Indispensables, will tell us the tale of a group of people who played absolutely key roles in the Revolutionary War in assistance to General Washington and the young nation in its epic struggle to separate from Great Britain. So without further ado, I'd like to now run this pre-recorded lecture, if you would, Mr. Patrick K. O'Donnell. Thank you very much.
I think last summer we saw the importance of a withdrawal under fire, how difficult that can be with Afghanistan. And that's where I'm going to take us tonight with The Indispensables and the American Dunkirk that was on August 29th, 30th, 1776. And this is arguably a point in the war, a true inflection point where all could have been lost. The Battle of Brooklyn raged a few days earlier, beginning on August 27, 1776, where the largest land battle and naval operation of its time up until that point in the war occurred. And the British Navy and Army were planning on destroying and trapping Washington's army in Brooklyn or Long Island. I wrote a book called Washington's Immortals, where the Maryland Regiment makes an epic stand that buys an hour more important to our history than any other. And these American Spartans allowed the army to escape to entrenchments at Brooklyn Heights. And it's here that the British Army began a siege, digging in and slowly moving forward to destroy the army and move up the East River behind it and cut it off. And Washington had a decision to make. Does he stand and fight, or does he retreat? And this is where the story of the Indispensables, these men really begin to save Washington's army for the first time of many times during the American Revolutionary War. And Washington calls a council of war and decides wisely to retreat. And with hardly any notice at all, he taps the experienced mariners of the Marblehead Regiment. These are the most experienced naval troops that Washington has at his disposal at Brooklyn that night to pull off the impossible, to transport 10,000 troops across the East River under the guns of the British Army in front and the British Navy on their back on the East River. And the boats that they had gathered from Manhattan, they came over a day or so earlier, and now with only hours to prepare, they gathered those boats and began one of the greatest evacuations in military history. And it's right under the nose of Washington's great adversary, the British Army, which was directly camped in front of them in their siege lines. Washington knew that secrecy was paramount. A single deserter could blow the entire operation, or a loyalist. And that's indeed what happened that night. A loyalist that was overseeing that their home was near the operation sent an enslaved servant that they had to alert the British that the Americans were pulling back. And Washington wisely told his men that they were advancing, but instead of advancing to the front, they were advancing to the rear, to the East River. And it was here the boats were starting to, the Marbleheaders, they're called the Marbleheaders because it's the town of Marblehead, which is, roughly 30 miles away from, or less than 30 miles away from Boston itself. And these men were the most experienced mariners in the Continental Army, are loading the boats. And this enslaved person ran into several Hessian troops. These are British allies that don't speak English, and they don't really understand what he's saying. And things are starting to gel, but they're not able to get this intelligence on time to the British High Command. Things are going very poorly for the evacuation that night, though. There was chaos at the dock. The wind was the biggest problem. Nothing seemed to be working that night. The wind was not catching the sails properly. The men were struggling against all odds, against the raging current in the East River. And the commander of the operation, General McDougal, tried to order its cancellation. They tried to find Washington that night, but they could not find him. And then thankfully, the operation moved forward and things started to change. The wind started to take a more favorable turn for the Americans. The men used cloth on their oars to muffle the sound of the waves as it was hitting the oars as they moved the boats across. And it wasn't one time, but a half a dozen times, or more than a dozen times, I should say, round trip, if you count each 6 or 7 times, they went across the river to pluck the men of the army, as well as all of their cannon and horses, the wounded men. And it was a race against time, though, because dawn was coming, and with it, the prying eyes of the entire British Army that was arrayed in front of them. And it's here that one of the great miracles, as the men that were there said, it was the divine hand of God, where a mysterious fog rolls in and screens the movement at exactly the right time of John Glover and the Marblehead Regiment's boats as they bring the rest of the army across the East River. And this is just one incident where these men are literally indispensable to the American Revolutionary War. The Marblehead Regiment then is vital to the next several months of the war. There's a slight pause where there's peace negotiations that go nowhere for about 2 weeks, and the British then land a massive force at Kips Bay, and they land on Manhattan. And Washington's army is there, to repel the invasion, and it goes incredibly poorly. Washington himself puts himself in the vortex of battle. He's out front. He's cheering his men on, but to his great chagrin and horror, they're fleeing at a rapid rate. They're not standing up to the British regulars that are landing and pushing forward into Manhattan. It's the Marylanders who had fought the engagement at the Battle of Brooklyn that fought an hour more precious in our history than any other, and the Marbleheaders that helped make a successful rear guard here at Kips Bay and stave off disaster. And it's Washington himself that is nearly killed during the battle. He's catatonic. A aide has to literally take the bridle and reins of his horse and move him off the battlefield, as British regulars are only about 400 or 500 yards in front of him and about to kill Washington. They are making the successful rear guard near Central Park, and they retreat into fortifications at Harlem Heights. And there's a successful battle of Harlem Heights. There's a little bit of a victory, a small victory there against British regulars, but then it's one defeat after another for the Continental Army, and it's a very, very disastrous time period. The Marbleheaders play a key role at a place called Throng's Neck, where an entire British invasion force lands further up the neck of Manhattan, and a small force of expert riflemen hold off that massive force long enough for the Marbleheaders and others to coalesce, and they're able to repel them there. They come again, and there's another sort of epic stand where the Marbleheaders allow the army to escape to White Plains. They play a vital role in the Battle of White Plains, and eventually the army is moving towards they perceive as the safety of New Jersey and then ultimately the Delaware River. And it's here that we are facing, it's November, there's another epic defeat at the Battle of Fort Washington, where nearly over 3,000 Americans are captured at the fort. There's some wounded Marbleheaders that are there as well, and it's an incredible disaster. The men are captured. Many of them are executed on the spot. They're bayoneted. The wounded and the standing are forced to run a gauntlet of British soldiers as well as Hessian troops, and they're kicked, stabbed, beaten, and they're robbed of their possessions. Many are killed. This occurs in front of Washington, who's on the other side of the Hudson River near Fort Lee, overlooking the operation as it disastrously unfolds for his army through his spyglass. Much of the indispensables it comes from first primary sources, from the participants themselves. And it uses what's known as pension application files. These are files, these are sworn affidavits that if you were lucky enough to survive the war, you could go to the local courthouse and swear under oath what you saw and did. And these are the great oral histories of the American Revolution. In many cases, they're untapped sources. I was, with Washington's Immortals, I was one of the first historians to really utilize this source. And I utilized it extensively with the indispensables, where I literally rebuilt Washington's Navy and the Marblehead Regiment from the ground up, through the muster rolls, where they listed the names of these individuals and then did biographical research on all of them that were found, and tracked each one of them down and literally rebuilt these regiments and ships muster rolls from scratch. But within these documents are some very compelling eyewitness accounts, and one of them is a guy by the name of Lawrence Everhart, who was lucky enough to survive Fort Washington by finding a rowboat and rowed across the Hudson River, landed in near the mansion that Washington was witnessing this disaster unfold. And he vividly recalls how Washington had tears in his eyes as he saw his men being bayoneted and stabbed and many killed. And this is arguably some of the darkest days in our republic. There was one defeat after another. The army was in full retreat. They're trying to make their way to the Delaware River before they're cut off. They have to go through New Jersey. And it's here that Washington realizes that the game is almost up, as he writes one of his relatives, that if he doesn't mount a successful counter offensive or attack, the war will be over, because not only has his army, which is attenuated from nearly 20,000 men, now down to near thousands, but the enlistments on those remaining men are about to expire. And these are indeed the days that try men's souls. And it's Washington that comes up with a counterattack at Trenton that will change the course of history, world history, and the course of the Revolution. It's a bold strike. The Trenton is one of many outposts in New Jersey. After the British had run Washington out of New York and New Jersey, and they had retreated to the other side of the Delaware, the British Army, along with their Hessian allies, had to find a way of occupying the town, the area that they had seized. This is a classic problem with counterinsurgency or any revolution, and they garrisoned it with outposts, different outposts, and Trenton was one of them. And each one of these outposts were mutually supporting, at least that was the plan, but they were in some ways vulnerable to an attack. And Washington chose the Trenton outpost, which was at this time garrisoned by one of the best Hessian regiments that they had. It was the Rall Regiment, which was under the command of Johann Rall. And unlike, the typical children's books that we hear that these guys were all drunk and incompetent, it's completely incorrect. Rall's regiment they're crack troops. They had led the attack at White Plains and the breakthrough there. They had led, personally, Johann Rall had led the attack during the Battle of Fort Washington and the breakthrough there. So this is an incredibly skilled commander, and he realized the precarious situation that he was in and demanded reinforcements constantly, because up until this point, it wasn't a single large attack, but he was being raided by the Continental Army as well as the militia that were in the area constantly, and he needed more troops. His men were constantly on alert. They were literally sleeping in their uniforms with their muskets next to their sides every night because they were worried about another attack. And Washington knows that he has to strike before the enlistments expire. And he's got several problems, whether or not it can be done with the troops that he has. But he's also got another natural barrier, and that is the Delaware. And it's once again, he calls upon his most experienced mariners, the men of the Marblehead Regiment, and John Glover in particular, who was the commanding officer of the brigade that regiment was part of. He had now been promoted to brigade commander, and asked him bluntly whether or not he could do it. Could he bring the army across this raging river? And it was a difficult task, just like the East River. It was almost mission impossible. And Glover says, "Don't worry, my boys can handle it." And he sets in motion the operation to take Trenton. And it's a complex plan. Washington devises a plan that's fairly complex. It's several multi-prongs that will attack Trenton at one time and cross the river. And here's the important point. Only one of those prongs succeeds. The others fail. And they fail because they don't have the experienced Marblehead men in the boats. The others are not able to get across the ice in the river, which on Christmas Day was an absolute nightmare. There was a nor'easter at the time. The river was jammed with ice. It was fast flowing. all of the other aspects of the operation failed, but the Marbleheaders got the men across, and things were quickly behind schedule though, because it took a great deal of time to get the main portion of the army, which Washington was part of, over the Delaware River, but they were able to do it. And he didn't know at the time whether or not the other aspects of the operation were succeeding or failing, so he pushed ahead. And they pushed ahead in a blinding snowstorm. And what many don't realize is that the British intelligence knew that a counterattack, counteroffensive was beginning, and it would happen at Trenton. Johann Rall was warned that it was going to occur, and there were several sources that warned him. But what occurred that night is, against orders, a company of Virginians made a raid, and Washington didn't know about it. They did it on their own, and they raided Johann Rall's troops. And there's a blinding snowstorm, and there's all kinds of other things going on. So Rall assumes that this is the attack that the British had warned him about, when in fact, in reality, a large portion of Washington's army is now barreling down on Trenton from the north, from their crossing point about 12 miles away. And his men are on edge, but the Continental Army and Glover's troops of the 14th Regiment are attacking, and they push forward towards the town. They're on the 14th. The Marbleheaders are on the part of the prong of the attack that sort of trails along what's known as the River Road, and it's trailing the Delaware River, while Washington and his main part of his army attack Johann Rall's the portion that contains several guns. But without orders, John Glover, the Marblehead men, and the other men in that brigade sees what's arguably the greatest real estate of the entire Revolution up until this point, which is the bridge at Assapeak Creek. And they take the high ground there and the bridge, and they cut off the main road of retreat for Johann Rall's men, and the main way that the other Hessian garrison and other British troops would reinforce Rall had they known that the battle was unfolding. So it's incredibly important. Without orders, they take the bridge, and what begins now is, unlike most 18th century battles where both armies fight and then retreat, it's an envelopment. In most of Rall's regiment, nearly all of it is enveloped and captured. Many, many men die, and Johann Rall himself is mortally wounded. It's here that Washington exercises American principles of not executing prisoners, unlike the British, which they had done at Fort Washington. Prisoners are treated fairly, and the trip across the river back to Pennsylvania, interestingly enough, is more dangerous, because the men find barrels of rum and the alcohol supply for the British Army. And against orders from Washington, many of the men are very much intoxicated as they're making their way over, and several men fall overboard. But they're able to extricate the army back, and it sets up another series of events where one of those prongs goes back over the river the next day without orders, and it's the Philadelphia Associators, and there's a force of nearly 2,000 men that are on the other side of the river, on the wrong side of the river as far as Washington's concerned, because he planned on staying on the other side of the Delaware and waiting for the British to attack him in his much more defensible position. But he had a decision to make. Does he reinforce John Cadwalader and the Philadelphia Associators, order them back, or move in? And he moves in. There's also The New Jersey militia is uprising, and this sets up what's known as the Second Battle of Trenton, or Battle of Assunpink Creek, where Marbleheaders play a role again, and then ultimately the Battle of Princeton, where where Washington is able, to prevail. And this is the 10 crucial days that change the course of the war. And it's the Marbleheaders that play a key role in all of this. Now, I sort of gave you an overarching view of what the Marblehead Land Regiment did, but it's now important to sort of go back in time to just detail exactly who these individuals were. They were also a diverse set of individuals, and some of the wealthiest men of the 13 colonies at the time, and some of the most determined. And their story begins in 1769. That's where the book begins, on the rolling deck of a ship called the Pitt Packet. And the Pitt Packet was one of Marblehead's fast schooners that was a trading boat, and it was returning from Europe with a cargo. And on their way back to Marblehead, which is at that time a very thriving seaport of about 5,000 inhabitants, and Marblehead makes its living through trade with Europe as well as the Caribbean, but also fish. And it's an economy built on cod. Cod fishing is a mainstay, and these men fish the Grand Banks and then trade. But on their way back on the Pitt Packet, they're bringing back cargo back to Marblehead, and suddenly they are accosted by the British Navy. It's a boarding party, and it's not a friendly one. The British board the ship and demand the crew. Up to a third or more of the British Navy was manned by slaves, or men that were they were impressed. They were brought against their will, paid a pittance, and it was life service for the most part. Most men died that were impressed on the boats and never returned to their families. And this was one of the causes of great discontent within the colonies, in Marblehead in particular, because men of their ships would go out to sea. They would brave some of the toughest waters in the world, especially cod fishing in the Grand Banks, where scores of men would die in those rough seas, only to come home and be impressed by the Royal Navy and never see their families again. But in 1769, in one of the first acts of defiance, these men fought back. And the British boarding party immediately resorted to violence. One of the officers' pistols discharged, shooting a man in the arm. The Marbleheaders, who were only armed with harpoons and axes and other, rough martial weapons, decided to fight back. And they warned the British officer, Michael Corbett warned the British officer that if he took a step further, he would kill him. And to demonstrate his resolve, there was a bag of salt that had broken up in the fracas a little bit earlier, and salt had spilled across the deck. Michael Corbett, a Marbleheader who was of Irish descent, took his foot and drew a line in the salt and said, "If you cross the line, you're a dead man." And the British lieutenant, who was very much arrogant, took a sniff of snuff and crossed the line and tried to seize Corbett and the others. And he was greeted by a harpoon to the jugular vein and killed instantly. And after a brief struggle, the men were apprehended and brought aboard the British vessel, the Rose. And it was here that the great, maybe arguably our first super lawyer plays a role. John Adams is the lawyer that's brought in to defend the crew and Michael Corbett for their actions, and he finds them innocent. And the book mines the great depositions that were from the court trial from Adams, and that this is just the beginning of resistance on the part of the Marblehead, but also active financing of the American Revolution, but also supplying of it, and supplying of it not only of material such as gunpowder, but of ideas. And it would be the Marbleheaders that would also furnish many of the great ideas of our liberty and independence. But this story starts to unfold. You have acts such as the Pit Packet. It's followed up by the Boston Massacre, where Marbleheaders are also involved. And it's then, as there's great turmoil within the New England area in particular, there's a beginning of a flourishing of a political revolution where the ideas of freedom and liberty, which are very foreign at this time, begin to flourish. And it's a Marbleheader, Elbridge Gerry, who is later the future vice president of the United States. And things are starting to gel, and a political revolution is starting to begin. Many of the ideas are flowing from the Marbleheaders, who are some of the wealthiest men in the colonies. And then, as this is unfolding, a virus strikes Marblehead and divides the town politically between loyalists, those that are loyal to the crown, and those that have many of these revolutionary ideas that I'll call patriots. And the town initially comes together to combat this virus, which is raging. They begin with quarantines where they set up areas that are designated only for people that have smallpox. And they wall it off. They kill dogs because the dogs are carrying smallpox, the virus. But nothing seems to be working. The pest house, as they're called. The virus continues to spread. And it's the patriots that come up with a novel solution, a dangerous solution at the time, which is inoculation. And they set up an inoculation hospital to combat the virus. And they build with their own funds. They initially have the support of the loyalists, but they turn against them for political means. They turn against them. They don't fund the hospital, and the hospital is built with the funds of the patriots, and it costs a massive fortune, about £2,000. And they build it on a place called Cat Island, which is a remote island off of Marblehead Harbor. And they have a lot of procedures to bring people on to the island. They have a clean room, sort of an airlock of the 18th century, where people change their clothes, get into new clothes, and then they're admitted into the hospital. And then the boat goes back with nobody on it. And they have to go through this very painful and potentially dangerous procedure of inoculation, where the top of their shoulder is lanced with a knife that contains a small portion of the virus, which will give, if it all works out well, the body some immunity. What happens, unfortunately, is the hospital is largely successful, but there are some patients that somehow go back into town and give it to others. And this causes the loyalists in the town to sense an opportunity. And they raise a mob. In the dead of night, men row over to Cat Island. And while the hospital contains women and children and other patients that are being inoculated, they burn it to the ground. Miraculously, nobody's killed. The men get away. And then John Glover, Elbridge Gerry, and the other Marbleheaders, including Jeremiah Lee, who's another patriot, go through the law and have the men arrested. And the loyalists foment violence. There's a massive riot, 1,000 strong, maybe more, that storm the jail with axes and crowbars and set the men free. And then what happens next is the houses and homes of these patriots are surrounded by the mob, who threaten to kill the men and burn their homes to the ground. John Glover has a novel approach to dealing with the matter. He knew they were coming, so he wheeled a 4-pound cannon, which was in his personal possession, from one of the ships that he owned, into the foyer of his home. And he patiently waited for the mob to show up on his front lawn. When they did, he ordered the front doors thrust open, and with a lighted torch in hand, it was a get off my lawn moment. And he threatened to fire the cannon into the mob. And they knew that he was serious, and they dispersed. And this incident causes the Patriots to lose political control of Marblehead and their ideas. But things change practically overnight with the Boston Tea Party. And there are Marbleheaders that are involved in that. And here, there's a complex reasons why it occurred. But the bottom line is the crown comes down with an iron fist. And part of that iron fist is they throw the entire town or city of Boston pretty much out of work because they blockade the port. There are other acts called the Intolerable Acts that come into play. And later on, something called the Fisheries Acts, which bans the Marbleheaders from using the Grand Banks, which effectively destroys all their livelihoods, come into play. And it's suddenly the political movement that was beginning, the first blossoms of it were beginning with the Marbleheaders in 1772 and beyond are starting to ignite and gain strength. And the Intolerable Acts and many other things combine. But really, the British know that Americans have one great weakness. They have guns, but they don't have gunpowder. And it's General Gage that actively decides to attack our Achilles heel, which is gunpowder. And it's the Marbleheaders that bring in the greatest amount of gunpowder in this early period. They are the trading power with Spain, Portugal, and as well as the Caribbean, that their ships bring in the bulk of the powder. And powder is targeted. It's targeted by Gage. The importation of it's targeted, but also the supplies of existing powder are targeted. And one of those supplies is at the Somerville gunpowder. There's a magazine in Somerville, which is located outside of Boston. And in the dead of night, around September 1, 1774, the powder magazine is raided. And it's an excellent operation. Over 200 British soldiers come in by small boat. They take out the powder and they leave, and they conduct an excellent operation. But in the midst of all this, there's a rumor that goes around that they'd killed 5 Americans. And this incenses Americans, and a massive mob forms. Some say up to 5, maybe even 10,000 people descend on Boston itself, and they surround the homes of British judges or anybody loyal to the British. They demand their removal, which they get, and they also just are about to march on Boston itself. But some patriot leaders, another individual such as Joseph Warren, who's a key figure in this book, many doctors play a huge role in the book. And one of my main characters is Joseph Warren's best friend. His name is Nathaniel Bond. And Bond runs the inoculation hospital because he's a specialist in smallpox and viruses. They are able to quell the crowd, but this sets off an arms race to gain power and arms and weapons as quickly as possible. Both sides are arming up. Gage informs his superiors in London that he's going to need upwards of 25,000 men, which is an insane number at the time. They don't even have that many in the army. They have to figure out a way to get that kind of, but he knows that they, with his own, with his mere roughly 3,000 men to hold all of North America, he's never going to be able to do it. With the colonies in what's the tip of a rebellion. But the powder becomes the critical source of everything. It changes the political revolution that's manifesting itself into a kinetic revolution. And what unfolds next are a series of operations to gain or secure powder. And the next one is at a place called Fort William and Mary. In December 1774, the first shots of the American Revolution are fired, arguably. A man is wounded. Americans seize British territory in the fort of Fort William and Mary, as well as dozens of barrels of gunpowder and cannon. They take the fort. The next operation that unfolds is the Salem gunpowder alarm, which is right next to Marblehead. And it's here that the revolution nearly ignites, but cooler heads prevail, and there's a bit of a whimsical experience where a drawbridge separates Marblehead and Salem, and the drawbridge is raised by the Patriots, and the British force that's there is not able to go search for the cannon and gunpowder that the Marbleheaders have covertly brought in from Spain and other places, and a deal is made where if they lower the bridge, they cross the bridge and they go over to the other side, but don't look for the powder, and then recross the bridge. And that's exactly what happens. The powder is saved. The British have their honor saved to some degree. They're able to cross the bridge, but the operation is a complete failure. And a little more than a month later, in April, we have the battles of Lexington and Concord, where it's Marbleheaders and their gunpowder that are the trigger event for the entire American Revolution. It's powder supplies that have been gathered by the Marbleheaders that are secreted away, that are stored in Concord in particular, and it's the British that launch a surgical raid based on intelligence from an informer, exactly where the powder and cannon are located, and they set off to find it. And they're only like partially a little bit successful. Most of the stuff is moved away, but it sets up the shot around the world. It sets up the first shots that were fired. The first shots, we don't even know exactly who fired them, but the second shot at Concord Bridge, we know that the British did. And it unfolds into this running gun battle where the British Army and that expeditionary force, which tried to seize these powder munitions and cannon, has to make this mad dash all the way back to Boston. And it's a gauntlet that they have to run through, and they barely make it. A relief force allows them to come in, but Americans are picking away at this long column, and they're inflicting a large number of casualties. And the British are also inflicting casualties as it goes along. Some of the first members of my family, the Mills family, were killed in this battle. And they make their way back to Boston sort of miraculously. But the Marbleheaders play a vital role in this as well, not only by the powder, but also fighting, but in what follows. And the Patriots were masters of information warfare. They understood that they had to be the victims on the world stage and not just rebellious colonists that had fired on the Crown's troops. And it was Elbridge Gerry that was in charge of gathering the depositions of British soldiers as well as American participants in the battle. And our report was based on that, along with a newspaper clipping. And we knew, the Marbleheaders knew, that the British were doing exactly the same. And they had a ship that left with General Gage's report before the ship that left the area near Salem, which is known as the Cuero. The Cuero is probably the most important ship that nobody's ever heard of, in the sense that it was carrying the American version of the American Revolution and how it started. And the Cuero goes without ballast. It's a fast ship, and she beats Gage's ship by over 2 weeks. And what happens is a information tsunami that changes the world. The information from the colonists on how the war began changes everything. And immediately Gage is on his back foot in terms of the information war and how the war started, everything else. And many British subjects are actually very sympathetic to the American cause. And this is an incredibly important event. And it's here that the Marbleheaders, as well as the other men of the militia, and as well as some of the other groups, surround Boston. And it's this siege of Boston that sets up the arrival of George Washington. And Washington arrives in the summer of 1775, and it's the Marbleheaders that are the first to guard General Washington. And he takes an immediate liking to John Glover, who's their commander at this time, because Jeremiah Lee had died from a sickness that he had developed from the Battle of Lexington after hiding in a cornfield at night. And it's Washington's great shock and horror that he realizes that the army has hardly any supplies of powder. And he, as well as Glover, it's not known exactly who came up with the idea, but the plan came about that ships were needed to potentially either seize British supplies of gunpowder at Halifax, for instance, or potentially seize British ships that were heavily laden with powder. And these were transport ships that were commercial ships. In some cases, they weren't guarded. So Washington came up with the idea of arming one of John Glover's fishing boats, a cruiser, a very fast ship that could potentially interdict these heavily laden British transports that were loaded with gunpowder. And this is their first armed vessel, the Hannah. And the Hannah makes its maiden voyage on September 5th, 1775. And it's a disaster. The ship goes out. They are able to evade the Lively and another British ship that's guarding Marblehead Harbor. And they seize a ship that they think is a prize. But what it is it's a ship called the Unity, which is a very large ship that was owned by John Langhorne, who was a delegate or a member of Congress, who was involved in the Fort William and Mary gunpowder raid. And the Unity was a British ship that Langhorne had that was sailing, and it was seized by a British ship, and it had a crew on board that were bringing their prize vessel back to Boston. So the Hannah seizes this ship, and they think it's a legitimate prize. They bring it back, and Washington inspects the papers, and to his horror, realizes it's a member of Congress's ship. And not only is it a member of Congress, but it's a member of Congress that's eventually part of the board that's involved in the potential for a navy, which is occurring about a month later. So Washington wisely gives the ship back immediately. because he realized he's got a political problem on his hands. He's got a covert Navy that he has funded and set up without authorization from Congress. But the Navy starts to unfold, and more ships are brought on, even without congressional approval. Ships go back out. The Hannah then engages in a ship-to-ship battle with the Lively and is nearly destroyed. It's quite an epic chase. More ships are brought on. After that, the prize issue, there was actually literally a small mutiny that took place with the discrepancy of Langhorne's ship, but the men are back in the boats again, the Marbleheaders, and more of these cruisers are brought online. And there are several more hiccups, to say the least. For instance, Washington micromanages the cruisers. Very strict rules and things are written down in terms of orders. But the men literally invade Canada, and they seize a man who's linked to the provisional governor up in the Nova Scotia area. He's brought back. Washington releases him, and the ships continue to have these hiccups. But then they seize one of the great prizes of the war, and the ship is loaded with ordnance and cannon, and it's exactly at the right time. And it's followed by more prizes. Captain Mugford seizes the Hope, for instance, which has dozens, scores, hundreds of barrels of powder on board that can supply either army for weeks. It's an incredibly important prize that it comes at exactly the right time and place. But what is also occurring is this asymmetric attacks by these small cruisers. They are manned by the Continental Army, and they are members that are given a percentage of the prize if they're able to seize the ship and the prize. And that's another issue because it takes time for it to adjudicate that. That process has to be put in play. But the ships have the cruisers, Washington's Navy, has another important role in driving up the insurance rates of all the commercial vessels that are bringing in powder and other vital supplies, such as food, across this nearly 3,000-mile supply chain from London to Boston. So that the ships are having an enormous impact on the war, indirectly. They're also creating important infrastructure. This is about sovereignty. These ships are now part of a sovereign nation, potentially, not just colonies that hope to make a peace with Great Britain. An independent flag, appeal to heaven, our first flag, is formed. Eventually, in October 1775, Congress orders the beginning of the U.S. Navy, and Washington's fleet is eventually folded into that. But it's here that ships cost money. Debt has to be raised. It's infrastructure. It's about the maintenance. It's about all the things that go into a Navy that makes us going down the path of independence rather than reconciliation. It's an incredibly important period of time. By not only the prizes that are seized, the great ordnance, the gunpowder, which is absolutely critical, but it's the origins of a government as well. And all of these things are coming together. First with Washington's Navy, and which has some very humble origins, just a fishing boat. And it's this Navy that is forming, that plays a key role, but also the regiment that plays a key role. And so many times that I talked about that it's the regiment that saves Washington's army on land from near defeat by their amphibious flexibility in operations. And going back to the virus, it's the Marbleheaders that once again save Washington's army. Because after the Battle of Princeton and the long retreat into New Jersey, Washington's army has to face an incredibly rough winter of 1777. And it's not only cold, it's the virus is raging in the Continental Army. It's killing more people than British bullets, and even the cold itself. The virus is killing many, many members of the Continental Army. And it's Washington that turns to a Marbleheader to save it. Dr. Nathaniel Bond, who had helped set up the hospital at Cat Island, has a very interesting story in this book. At the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Dr. Bond practices his Hippocratic Oath. He not only saves American soldiers, or patriots, if you will, but he saves members of the British Army that are wounded in the battle. And this creates a massive uproar. He's labeled a loyalist incorrectly, or traitor, for his role in just saving the lives of men that he's sworn to do. And his house is surrounded by an angry mob. He writes a letter to Elbridge Gerry. I have the only original copy of it, that desperately tells the story of what happened and how the mob will kill him in the next morning if Gerry doesn't send an armed guard to bring him down to the courthouse to tell his story in a court-martial in front of Joseph Warren, what exactly happened. And they send an armed detail to bring him out of the area, and he swears under oath in a court-martial what exactly happened, and he's exonerated. And for a man that is besmirched, his honor is soiled by incorrectly labeling him a loyalist, he instead does what many think is the impossible. He joins Glover's Marblehead Regiment, and he's not just a surgeon. He's a fighting surgeon. He's a company commander, and he fights in all earlier and saves countless lives as a doctor. But he's also a fighting company commander and is involved in Trenton. But many of the men of the regiment, after the Battle of Trenton, after the Battle of Chesapeake Creek, go home to Marblehead because their enlistment expires. Dr. Bond stays. And George Washington calls upon him for arguably his most important service, which is to inoculate the entire Continental Army, which Dr. Bond does. And he sets up all the inoculation hospitals. The army is inoculated, and it's impervious to the virus, and it's able to fight on, which, had it not happened, it might have changed the course of the war. Through his service, though, Dr. Bond perishes, and he dies after possibly through the virus. It's not known. But Dr. Bond is a forgotten figure until I wrote The Indispensables. And it's his story and many others that are the reason why we are who we are today. And it's the reason why I wrote the book. And as we know today, it's the story of the American Revolution that is more important now than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. O'Donnell. And I want to make a couple points. One is that the last part of the book is, what happened to these Marbleheaders, and what happened to them is they lost their fortunes, they lost their ships, they lost everything, and they sacrificed everything to enable the work they did and the participation they had in the Revolutionary War. I want to thank Mr. O'Donnell for a great presentation. I also want to talk to you about the fact that he was playing hurt. He was sick as he could be. He had a high fever. His face was flushed. He was a mess. So he played hurt. He did did this for us, and we're just so pleased and thankful that he did. If you haven't bought Dr. Meralda's book yet, what's the matter with you? Okay, so get out there and get online and buy Admirals in Peril. And at this point, I just want to say this is the end of our annual meeting. We love our foundation members. We thank you for your participation, and I'm ready to accept a motion to adjourn the annual meeting. So moved and seconded. All in favor, aye. Aye. And all opposed? The ayes have it. Our meeting is adjourned. Thank you for joining us, and we will post just this brief, just Mr. O'Donnell's brief by separate cover sometime in the next few days. So stand by for that if you